Hey guys, so we're going to start reading chapter 16, Singing in the Clouds. If you remember from the last chapter, Louis, Mac, and Phil fought off being attacked by a Japanese bomber. It came by 7 different times, shot their rafts with bullets. The bullets made a lot of noise in the water, attracted the sharks. The sharks start jumping them, and they said that if all 3 of them had not been there, that they would not have made it, because Louis patched the holes on the raft. There were hundreds of them. Louis patched the holes. Phil pumped air into the raft to keep it afloat, and Mac hit the sharks. So this is an example of a World War II raft. So think about how cramped they were, and they've already been in there at least 27 days. So that's what one of those looks like. And so they had to keep, if all 3 of them hadn't been there, then they would not have made it. All right, chapter 16, Singing in the Clouds. Louis sat awake, looking into the sea. Phil slept. Mac was in a reverie. 2 sharks, about 8 feet long, were circling placidly. Louis had banged the sharks on the nose, but never really felt their skin. Curious, he dropped his hand in the water and laid it lightly on the shark, feeling its back and dorsal fin. It felt like sandpaper. A second shark passed, and Louis felt his hand and followed its body. Beautiful, he thought. Soon after, Louis noted something odd. Both sharks were gone. Never had the sharks left. Louis leaned over the water, puzzled, looking down. Without warning, one of the sharks Louis had touched leapt up at a terrific speed, mouth open wide, lunging at Louis's head. Louis threw both hands in front of his face. The shark struck him head-on, trying to get his mouth around him. Louis shoved, and the shark splashed back into the water. A moment later, a second shark jumped up. Louis grabbed an oar and struck the shark in the nose, and it jerked and slid away. Then the first shark lunged for him again. Louis saw an oar swing past, sending the animal backwards into the ocean. To his surprise, it wasn't Phil who had saved him. It was Mac. Louis had no time to thank him. One of the sharks jumped up again, and then another. Louis and Mac clubbed at them. A moment before, Mac had seemed almost comatose. Now he was infused with energy. For several minutes, the sharks took turns bellying onto the raft. Finally, they gave up, and Louis and Mac collapsed. Louis beamed at Mac, telling him how grateful and proud of him that he was. Mac, crumpled on the floor, smiled back. He had pushed himself beyond his body's capacities, but his frightened expression was gone. Mac had reclaimed himself. So Mac has finally redeemed himself in Louis's eyes, and Mac is no longer scared of being on the raft, so he's back to his normal self. Louis was furious at the sharks. He stewed all night, scowling hatefully at them all day, and decided that if the sharks were going to try and eat him, he would try and eat them. He and Phil made a plan. Spotting a shark about 5 feet long, Phil hung bait from one end of the raft. Louis knelt at the other end, facing the water. As the shark swam to Phil, Louis plunged his hands into the water and grabbed its tail. The shark took off, yanking Louis into the ocean and flinging him off. Louis bolted back onto the raft. Soaked and embarrassed, Louis rethought his plan. His first error was to underestimate the strength of sharks. His second was to fail to brace himself. The third was to allow the shark's tail to stay in the water, giving it water to push against. A small shark, perhaps 4 feet long, arrived. Louis knelt at the raft's side, tipping his weight back and spacing his knees. Phil dangled the bait. The shark swam for the bait. Louis clapped his hands around the tail and heaved it into the water. The shark heaved it out of the water. The shark thrashed, but he couldn't get free. Louis dragged it onto the raft, and as the shark twisted and snapped, Phil grabbed a flare cartridge and jammed it into the shark's mouth. Pinning the shark down, Louis stabbed the pliers through the animal's eye. The shark died instantly. Louis had been told that the liver was the only edible part of the shark. After much sawing with the mirror edge, Louis found it, and it was sizable. They ate it with relish. Soon afterwards, they caught a second small shark and ate its liver too. Among the sharks, the word got around. No more small sharks came near, and the men's stomachs were soon empty again. Mac was in a sharp downward spiral. He rarely moved. His eyes, sunken in their sockets, stared out lifelessly. It was night, around the 30th day. So they've been on the raft for 30 days now. The moon shone. The men slept. Louis woke to a tremendous crash and the sensation of weightlessness. His eyes snapped open and he realized that he, Mac, and Phil were airborne. They flopped down together and twisted in confusion. Something had struck the bottom of the raft with awesome power. Then they saw it. Swelling from the ocean came a vast white mouth, a broad back, and a tall dorsal fin. The animal was gigantic, some 20 feet long. It was a great white shark. As the castaways watched in terrified silence, the shark swam around the raft, exploring it. It paused, swished its tail away, and then slapped it hard into the raft, splashing a wave of water onto the men and sending the raft skidding sideways. Louis, Mac, and Phil clung to each other. The shark swam to the other side. Louis whispered, "Don't make a noise." Again came the mighty swing, the shower of water, and the jolt. As the men huddled, around and around the shark went, playing with the raft, drenching it with each pass. Finally, the great back slid under and the sea smooth beneath it. In the morning, Mac couldn't sit up. Louis caught an albatross, wrenched its head off, and handed it to Phil, who let the blood flow into Mac's mouth. They ate the bird eagerly, and Phil and Louis dipped the meat into the ocean to give it flavor. They fed bites to Mac, but it didn't revive him. On the evening of the 33rd day, Mac turned his face to Louis. "Am I going to die?" Louis looked at Mac. He didn't want to lie to him, in case he had something he needed to say or do before his life left him. He said that he thought that he would die that night. Mac had no reaction. Phil and Louis lay down, put their arms around Mac, and fell asleep. Sometime that night, Louis was lifted from sleep by a breathy sound, a deep outrushing of air, slow and final, and he knew what it was. Francis McNamara, which is Mac, had begun his last journey with a panicked, disastrous act, consuming the only food that they had. But in his final days, in the struggle against a deflating raft and jumping sharks, he had given all that he had left. It probably had hastened his death, but he may have saved Phil and Louis. At the end of his brief life, Mac had redeemed himself. In the morning, Phil and Louis knelt over his body. Louis wanted to give him a religious eulogy, but he didn't know how, so he recited passages from movies. And he prayed for himself and for Phil. If God would save them, he vowed, he'd serve heaven forever. Louis cradled Mac's body. It felt as if it weighed no more than 40 pounds. He slid Mac gently into the water. Mac sank away, and the sharks let him be. The next night, Louis and Phil completed their 34th day on the raft. That's a month and 3 days. Though they didn't know it, they had passed what was almost certainly the record for survival adrift an inflated raft. If anybody had survived longer, they hadn't lived to tell about it. The raft bobbed west. Storms came now and then, replenishing the water. Louis made a hook out of his lieutenant's pen and caught one fish before the pen broke. Phil and Louis could see the bend of their thigh bones under their skin, their bellies hollow, their ribs stark. Their skin glowed yellow from the dye of the raft. Their hunger dimmed, an ominous sign. That's, in case you didn't know, if you are starving, one of the things that shows that you're not doing so good is that you stop being hungry. Let's see. They had reached the last stage of starvation. One morning they woke to a strange stillness. The raft sat motionless. The ocean stretched out glossy smooth, reflecting the sky in crystalline perfection. They had found the doldrums. the eerie pause of wind and water that lingers around the equator. Phil watched the sky, whispering that it looked like the surface of a pearl. The water looked so solid that it seemed like you could walk on it. When a fish broke the surface away, the sound carried to them with absolute clarity. Pristine ringlets of water circled outward around the place where the fish had passed and then faded. They fell into reverent silence. Their suffering was suspended. They weren't hungry or thirsty. Such extraordinary beauty, Louis thought, was too perfect to have come by chance. That day was to him a gift crafted deliberately and compassionately for him and Phil. Joyful and grateful as they were dying, Louis and Phil bathed in that day until sunset brought it to an end. On the 40th day, so 40 days on the raft, Louis was lying beside Phil under the remains of Phil's ruined raft which Louis had made into a canopy. But suddenly he sat up. He heard singing. He nudged Phil and asked if he heard anything. Phil said no. Louis slid the canopy off and squinted into the daylight. Above him, floating in a bright cloud, he saw the silhouettes of 21 human figures. They were singing the sweetest song he had ever heard. Louis stared up, awestruck, and what he was seeing was impossible, yet he felt absolutely lucid. So he knows that what he's seeing he can't believe it, but it seems so real to him. This was, he felt certain, no hallucination. He sat under the singers, memorizing the melody until it disappeared. Phil had heard and seen nothing. Whatever it was, it belonged to Louis alone. So they're slowly getting to the point where there's no return, like they're about to die, and they're getting to that stage of hunger where they're not hungry anymore. A week passed with no food and no rain. The raft was a gooey mess, its patches bubbling outward, about to pop. It wouldn't bear the men much longer. Phil noticed that there were more birds. Then they began to hear planes. Sometimes they'd see a tiny speck in the sky, always much too distant to be signaled, and surely Japanese. As the days passed, though, more planes appeared. On the morning of the 46th day, no sunrise came. There was only a gloomy illumination of an ominous sky. Phil and Louis looked up apprehensively. The wind caught them sharply. The sea churned and arched its back, sending the raft into dizzying heights. To the west, something appeared, so distant that it could only be glimpsed from the tops of the swells. The moment the sea tossed them up and their eyes grasped it, Louis and Phil knew what it was. It was an island. So they have finally, 46 days in, they spot an island. I wonder what will happen next. I will see y'all next time.